good afternoon, good evening to everyone who's joined this webinar. And I know that there are people joining from all around the world and who might watch this webinar later as well. So welcome to you all. And as we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded lands on which we work, learn and live. So here in Melbourne for us, it's the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung and Bunurong peoples. And I'd like to pay respect to elders, past and present, and acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledge in the Academy. So again, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this COP Wash Up webinar today. I'm thrilled to have an esteemed panel with us today, and I'll introduce everyone in a minute. But I think we are really at a critical point in terms of the COPs. We've seen a whole range of sentiments being shared recently, particularly on this COP that was held in Baku a few weeks ago. Many were left bitterly disappointed. There were accusations of the host country of conflict of interest and malpractice. One minister talked about the hosting style labelled as deplorable. So we've heard a lot of comments around the COP that was just held. We also saw an open letter by the end of the first week that was signed by many high-level dignitaries, including the former UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon and the former UN Climate Chief Christiana Figueres, noting that the COP process needs major redesign and that countries that do not support fossil fuel phase-out should not be able to take up the presidency. So it's with that sort of background that we're talking about, well, what happened at the COP that just occurred this year? What does this mean for future COPs? And how do we actually ensure that the climate action that's necessary for the transformative changes that we must see is actually going to happen? So with that background, I'll introduce you to our wonderful panel joining us today. So we have Professor Jackie Peel. Jackie is the Director of Melbourne Climate Futures and an internationally recognised international environmental law expert. So welcome, Jackie. We have Janine Felson, who is an Enterprise Fellow here at Melbourne Climate Futures at the University of Melbourne. Janine wears many hats, including as one of the most important and probably highly stressful roles at COPs in being oftentimes one of the co-facilitators of the negotiation blocks. So that's with Janine's hat on as an ambassador for Belize, but you hold many roles, Janine, and perhaps you'll mention those today as well. And we have Associate Professor Kate Coleman, who is from the Faculty of Education here at the University of Melbourne. And Kate co-leads the climate change education stream here at Melbourne Climate Futures. So you've all had different roles to play in this COP, and it would be great to hear what you were doing there at an individual level. But I think building on what I mentioned in the opening statement around the controversy that surrounded this COP, both beforehand and during, and really, we know that not many people had high expectations for this COP. So it's intriguing to understand why this was the case. So Jackie, did you want to provide an initial response to that?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. And it's a pleasure to be on the panel and also with Janine and Kate. I think expectations were low for a variety of reasons. The one major reason, of course, was the timing of the COP happening just a week after the finalisation of the results in the US election. So everyone knew heading in that we were having Trump 2.0 administration in the US and that one of his signature policies would be around withdrawing the US from the Paris Agreement. So there was a lot of nervousness about what that might mean for the COP, for multilateral climate action in general, and for the signature item that was on the agenda around agreeing a new collective quantified finance goal. I think the other thing which you've kind of alluded to was a lack of trust or a lack of or some concern about the capacity of the presidency of Azerbaijan. They were appointed very late in the process, really only in the final days of COP28 in Dubai last year. And so had limited time to prepare, but also seemed to have a very lax way of coordinating across the negotiations. That was not helped by their very clear preference for facilitating fossil fuel deals on the sides of the COP negotiations, rather than really pushing hard on some of the progressing, particularly the key mitigation outcomes around transition away from fossil fuels that we'd seen at the COP meeting. And then finally, something that Kate might particularly talk to as well, there was a very repressed civil society presence at this meeting. There wasn't a facility for protests outside the venue. The capacity to organise inside the venue was quite limited by the nature of the venue. And so that feeling of tension, nervousness, and then a lack of trust really permeated the whole of this COP for the 2 weeks of the negotiations.
Thanks, Jackie. And I think, yeah, your note there in terms of civil society presence, so it'd be great to hear Kate's perspective on that. We've been seeing over the past few COPs a rapid increase in civil society participation legitimately. Last year at the COP, we saw 100,000 delegates who made it to the COP in Dubai, so an enormous number. A large portion, or a reasonably large portion of those people would have been from civil society, so really raising the voice of civil society. This year, I think the number in Baku was back down to about 60,000. But Kate, do you have any thoughts on civil society engagement at this COP?
Yeah, so even the ability to have a badge and observe was already made difficult. So, I was very lucky to have the badge from the University of Melbourne. It meant that I was only present for week one. But I also travel with young youth delegates from Emory University, and we had half the delegate that we were able to travel with last year. So last year we had 12 young people with us. This year we were able to have 6. And that was already kind of fraught with how they felt about attending. And that's already contextual with young people, because many young people that I work with have no idea what COP is. And then when we actually talk about it in the research that I do, they're incredibly hopeful. And I had come to Baku from India, where I'd been working with young people there. And so in that context, they were really hopeful about what COP might be able to do for them. And the people that we'd worked with in the weeks before COP really had an idea that the finance comp might actually be supportive for young people in India, where the young people I'd worked with here in Melbourne were kind of a bit more pessimistic, a little bit more knowledgeable about the deal, the site, and what climate justice actually means when we're heading into a space like that. And so then when there's already less of us, how do you actually do the intergenerational bit that we get to do when civil society's there? And then the site didn't actually really enable much of that, because we were almost separated, like as one of the young people said that we were working with, like a big Westfield shopping centre. And so, you have one bit of hangout and another bit of hangout, and it's very rare that you meet anywhere, because they're designed in a way that doesn't happen too often. And it really did feel like that. There's a kind of high end bit of shopping and then the lower end bit. And so those of us in the side event spaces were able to do what we did. And then the other bit seemed very far away, and you would stand in lines for a long time and then be told to leave and not get into anything anyway. And so that was made really difficult. And the young people that we traveled with kept that pessimism then each day, as it felt more difficult to participate.
Yeah, well, they're really interesting reflections, Kate. Yeah, I don't think Westfield shopping centres are known for their propensity for collaboration. They're also similarly kept in the dark, so you never know what time it is in a shopping centre like that. So it sounds fairly similar to COP processes as well. But yeah, I mean they're really important insights from young participants, Kate. Janine, do you have any thoughts about expectations for this COP?
I think we probably have to differentiate expectations based on the different countries that you're dealing with. So certainly from the side of small island developing states and least developed countries, there were high expectations for this COP, this finance COP. And my role in COP, working up to COP29, was specifically in the new collective quantified goal in an advisory role with the Alliance of Small Island States. And I can't tell you how many hours we've spent preparing for across regionally, but also regionally through sub-regions for the new collective quantified goal discussion. So there were very high expectations because this COP should have been consequential in finance. And whilst the election results from the United States certainly loomed fairly large in this COP, I would say that the process for the new collective quantified goal was 3 years long. And up until the point that we even received a text on Saturday, there was no quantum provided from which to work. And so at that point in time, I think that the level of expectation had basically been sort of sealed as being something that would look very low ambition in the end. And in the end, in fact, that is what we received. So I think, you know, differentiating in terms of the different countries coming to the table, there would have been very different expectations from the COP itself. So that would be my only addition there.
In terms of the new collective quantified goal, Janine, I mean, does that have parallels with other negotiation streams in terms of the length of time that it takes to develop up the initial negotiation items and the years involved with sort of getting different parties or countries up to a same level of understanding? So are there any parallels you can draw with other negotiation streams? I mean, we know for the global goal on adaptation, for example, that's also got a similarly long timeline and unexpected, you know, we're not entirely sure what's going to come out of that. Are there any other parallels?
Well, the global stocktake, and that has its 2-year process. It occurs every 5 years, the political aspect of it. And that's going to start up in 26 to conclude in the 2028. And in fact, Catherine, that was one of the missing outcomes from COP29. So there are many different processes that have been developed over the course of the climate regime, which sees, you know, there have been other ad hoc work programs to develop even the Paris Agreement, as well as ad hoc work programs to develop rules for the Paris Agreement. And we've seen more recently with this COP, the finalization of the Article 6 rules. So there are many different processes like that where there's sort of an iterative process of developing text that then becomes considered within the COP, or in this case, the CMA. So yeah, there are some drawn out processes for sure within the climate regime.
Yeah, and that might, you know, for some people who are joining the webinar might be quite, you know, enlightening, understanding the process and the many years that are involved in all of these negotiations. It doesn't just happen at the COP. There's also the intersessionals that are held, but also beyond that. There are many other meetings, as you flagged, Janine, that you've been heavily involved with in particular over the last, well, many years. I think it'd be great to know. I mean, you've all flagged some of the activities you were involved with at the COP, but Kate, perhaps if we can go back to you and hear a little bit more about the engagement you had with young people and the delegation you were supporting from Emory University. Perhaps you can talk a bit about the side events you were involved with, just to give our audience a bit of a sense of what happens at the COP.
Yeah, we had a side event. And so that was focused on youth voices for climate action, and it was all located around climate stories. So part of the research I do here at the university with Swiss Lab is to, in partnership with Science Gallery International, collect these climate stories that locate young people inside climate change. And so how do they locate their own tipping points and then start to locate them within their stories? And that's the work that we met Emory University through. And then we had, as the merge deals happen to create these side events, each night, very late at night, mergers happen between different organizations to create this side event that will work. We merged with the World Association for Girl Guides and Girl Scouts. And so we had this amazing group of young people that had then through the week also grabbed other young people until we just had a whole panel of 14 to 28-year-olds. And then Dr. Sarah Healy and I were able to read the stories of the young people that we carry in their stories. And so then we opened that up into a large participation around what people's tipping point stories are, to take that feeling that the tipping points seem far away, particularly in India when we talk about tipping points, and they want to locate that in a story from the Himalaya, for instance, and they know what that feels like when that family has lived in drought for so long. So it was an amazing room. Lots of side events had tech issues. It seemed to be the tech issue time of COP. Everything I went to, every youth-led climate forum had the same tech issues that we did, because you could only use the COP computer or have to have a flash drive, which nobody seemed to have. But I think the feeling in the room for us was that all of the work that takes young people and the stories and the research and all of that to get into the room and then create the opportunity for other young people to tell those stories. The beautiful bit that the Girl Guides and Girl Scouts did in our participatory work was to turn the room into hope. And so how do you flip that tipping point into hopeful tipping points? And then we collected that from everyone that was in the room. We'd done something very similar last year. And so that bit of hopefulness, I guess, is what we carried. We also hold some side events have exhibit booths, and we held that. I think I made over 300 climate action badges. I was literally there with the machine every day making badges with young people, getting rid of everyone over 30 because I would only make them for under 30s. But, so that you could wear an action, because one of the things that was different this year was people were asked not to bring things, which is so important, because otherwise it feels like a big commercial product. But there's lots of young people that wanted to wear their actions, and they didn't really have an opportunity because they often go around and collect badges and trade badges with each other. And so we then were making them and actually creating that opportunity. It's a really weird thing, side events and exhibits, because you're busy the whole time making contacts, and it's where I think the exciting bit when you're working in that intersectional space occurs, because there's so many people from different organizations that come and find you and read the list and then come down and find you in the booth and then work out how to connect.
That is amazing. That's so inspirational, what you've just described, Kate. I must say that when I've been to the COPs, I do go and check out the youth or the young people pavilion, because it's always such exciting stuff happening. It's really energizing. So thrilled to hear you were supporting something that had a focus on hope as well, because we know that there is really what I see as quite an imbalance in terms of the despair and the real burden that our young friends and colleagues face. So how do we balance that? It doesn't mean dismissing the burden and the grief surrounding what the future holds, but it is actually, well, how do we also support this vision of hope? Because without hope, how do we all work together? That's a real
young people couldn't be at COP if they can't see the hope side, because the way that the data is presented every day, every 2 hours in every forum is devastating. And the ways that the visualizations occur from any country that any young person comes from, they can see the devastation. And so just being able to hold that and then work with young people is so necessary in that, because otherwise, seeing that by 2100 in your lifetime, your country doesn't exist in a room that wasn't focused on that, but that's what you're seeing, is, it's so heartbreaking. And so to hold that in those sessions is incredibly necessary. Otherwise, how do they walk out of COP and actually have anything to go back to at home that is hopeful?
Yeah, well, I hope we see some of your work here at the Science Gallery in Melbourne, because that's fairly convenient for those of us based in Melbourne. So please do let us know. Jackie, I know you were there with many hats on as well, one of which was likely related to the university's COP Alliance, which you are the current chair of. So did you want to talk a little bit about what the events were that you were involved with, particularly around the university's perspective?
Yeah, and I was just reflecting on Kate's comment that it's a strange place, COP. It's in many ways, it's the best place to meet a whole lot of people who are doing exciting work around climate change, located in the worst place to actually feel like you're achieving change. So I had a couple of different hats on going into COP. I was following the negotiations because I'm writing on international climate law, international environment law. I'm doing a big project or starting a big project around the role that corporations might play in taking forward climate action. So alongside the negotiations, there's lots of things with private investor and corporate groups going on where you can really get a sense of that level of activity. And then, as you mentioned, I'm chairing a new group of Australian and Pacific universities that are coming together around how universities across our region can better support the COPs and actually achieving good outcomes at them, and looking specifically to the opportunity that may arise, fortunately not confirmed at COP29, of Australia hosting COP30 in 2026 together with the Pacific. So I did spend quite a lot of time in the Australian pavilion, meeting up with contacts from across those different universities, and also observing some of the events in the pavilion. They unfortunately didn't include a lot of events with civil society. It was quite interesting, the Australian pavilion this year. It had a really strong industry focus. It was almost like the agenda had been written by our Department of Climate Change and Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade to be very focused on our bilateral trade interests in the region. So I think it's always really interesting who comes to COP. Part of the reason I think we see an increasing number of people coming, which of course strains the venues that these things are held in, is because there's not really any other sort of site where you can get this diversity of people interested in climate change coming together.
Thank you, Jackie. I think that the role of universities seeing, is being seen now as perhaps more important than it has been in the past. And so getting a sense of how universities are placing themselves to support the evidence or the knowledge base to help inform policymakers, negotiators, and so on at the COPs, but also proceeding, I think, is an area for further work for us also to think about as researchers. How can we be perhaps a bit more flexible in the types of work that we do, perhaps proactive in understanding what the policy gaps might be, where the tricky areas might be that we can provide some evidence or knowledge, whatever term you'd like to use. So I think that it is a really interesting time for universities at the moment, and the role that we play in COPs and beyond around climate policy and development of responses. Janine, I flagged you have many hats at the COP. You've been very, very intimately involved in actually co-facilitating negotiations in the past. You mentioned your core role around the new collective quantified goal over the past little while. Is there anything you wanted to highlight in terms of your involvement at this last COP?
Yeah, I think one of the key areas that became highly significant in the negotiations on the climate finance was the close alliance across vulnerable groups of countries. Certainly in when was it, 2018, 2019, during the Madrid COP or the Chile Madrid COP, that alliance was also very significant as we started looking at various new avenues that had to be negotiated, especially around loss and damage, where the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage came to be established. But significantly here in Baku, that alliance really became important in at least trying to anchor some key outcomes for vulnerable groups of countries within not only the finance goal, but across the agenda, especially in mitigation and adaptation. regrettably, loss and damage saw less progress in this COP. But at least in adaptation, there was some movement procedurally for the global goal on adaptation. So working across that dynamic was very important. And I wanted to just jump back to your opening comments, Catherine, when you mentioned that we are at a critical point for COPs. And I think if we think before we got to Baku, there was the Cartagena COP, the CBD COP. Cartagena dialogue is in my mind because of climate change. But the Convention on Biological Diversity COP, which ended in basically it couldn't conclude. Then we went to COP29. The plastics negotiations, as I understand, have closed without any result. I think we're at a critical point for multilateralism, and that's because there are lots of shifts in geopolitical dynamics. There are different groupings that are, coming forward in negotiations. So it's not only, elections in developed countries that are becoming relevant, but really how the overall landscape of politics is evolving and impacting how multilateralism works. And so that's why I go back to that close-knit alliance between the vulnerable countries. And that became even more important to try to solidify clear outcomes that would be beneficial for a group of countries who literally were left out of the room when some of the major decisions were being taken. Thanks.
And if I could just build on Janine's point there, because I think it's really important for how we might evaluate the results of COP29 in the wash-up. So if you actually take that broader view of multilateral environmental action under threat, the fact that finance was the crucial issue at the biodiversity COP that resulted in it not being resolved, at the plastics meetings that have just been held trying to agree a new treaty. It was the intervention of states on behalf of fossil fuel interests that was the crucial breaking point. We're about to have another convention meeting on desert. I can never say this word, on deserts, land degradation, being held in Saudi Arabia, which was one of the main countries sort of acting against progress at COP29. So in that context, if you look at it through that broad view, you say, well, actually COP29 was sort of a incremental, moderate success. It's saved at least the progress under the Paris Agreement, some sense of countries being able to come together even without probably the US playing the same major role, new alliances forming between the Europeans and the Chinese on taking forward finance. I'm not sort of saying any of the issues that Janine's highlighted. The fact that vulnerable countries were largely left in the dust by the agreement that was reached on the new collective quantified goal. But in a context where we were seeing a lot of other multilateral processes falling over, there was some sense of relief in the fact that COP29 got to some outcomes, however weak they may be seen to be.
Yeah, there was a clear determination to finish with an outcome, and the strength of that, yes, is undeniably low. Kate, do you have any reflections on the COP and the key outcomes, particularly, I suppose, with your education lens or with your young people lens?
I went to one of the youth-led forums on mitigation, loss, and damage. And it was interesting because every other youth-led forum had ended in the same way, which was they just kept coming back to, and everyone in the room beautifully in those youth-led forums let youth lead all the discussion. But there was a return in that one very forcefully around education, and that why do we why do we talk around everything without actually locating with young people what climate change education looks like? And one person, I just went to find it in my notes, because one young woman from the Global South said, I would like to not be obliged to leave my country. And everyone in the room stopped. I've written it on a page and left it even with no other notes around it. And then another young person picked up, and why aren't we then talking about what that looks like in our climate change education? And why is there no money being put aside for that? If we talk about this being a finance COP, where are the finances for climate change education? And I think somebody mentioned, I've got it in my notes, that I think 2.4% of finance funds are delegated into climate change education, which I need to find and work out whether or not that's real or not, because that seems quite low, but it might be even nothing. Young people just kept returning to that over and over again. You know, if we're going to talk about anything, where do they even learn about what this is? There's presentations in the youth-led forums where special envoys come and explain what's happening in each of the negotiations. Some young people that only managed to get into at least 2 negotiations that I understood. Otherwise, young people weren't really at the table. How do they actually know what's happening? Which means you only have a certain group of very privileged young people, even from developing and underprivileged nations, still being present there. And without young people who, you know, we talk all the time, and young people know they're inheritors, how do they actually get to converse in all of these things that are decisions being made when they actually don't see decisions being made? And then what does it look like? It felt very troubling in every one of those youth-led sessions, that they were so incredibly passionate and angry about things. And then at like every forum, it would end. And then everyone would race to another event, and any notes that you had about things that were left unsaid or still troubling just ended. And I feel like that even in this conversation, it's like, you know, these are really important decisions that need to be made. And when they're not being made, and then young people then want to actually see things happen, how can we actually produce change for them? I'm unsure, even as someone who works with young people, to give them a conversation around things that might change.
Yeah, you've painted a very clear picture of the power imbalance that we see in these sorts of fora, and young people, other groups that are underrepresented as well. But I think, you know, critically, it's just an issue that we must address. And I wonder, Janine, you know, you sort of flagged this as well in your comments. Did you want to talk any further about the representation of certain perspectives that weren't necessarily heard or were not adequately responded to through the negotiation process? As much as you can speak to that. I know this is a public event, so there's perhaps some things you can't make note of, but what you can share would be really interesting to us all, I think.
Yeah, this might go into, you know, how COPs are organized in particular. And I think we've seen a change in negotiation processes across COPs. So, you know, initially very much party-led negotiations have become now ministerial-led negotiations. And it's really important to begin to look to which countries are represented in those ministerial pairs, and how do you gain the transparency in those consultations that occur? You're invited, a delegation will be invited to a ministerial consultation in their singular capacities, not alongside other countries. So it's unclear what's happening and who's saying what. And then a document is produced that supposedly reflects the balance of views, and then the balance of views is not quite the balance of views from every single country's point of view. So I think it really goes into the whole discussion about how COPs have begun to evolve into these really I would call siloed processes, and lacking a fair amount of transparency overall in the negotiations. There was a critical point, and it was reported, of course, where the vulnerable countries decided that enough was enough. And many Submissions had been made, many meetings had been held, consultations with the principals in charge of the negotiations, and yet not a single reference to the core asks were represented in the texts that were produced for the decisions on the new collective quantified goal, and they effectively walked out of the meeting because of that lack of representation of views, the lack of balance of views within the context of the negotiating text. So I think what we're seeing is it was a really critical point for the negotiations. It was a call out for some reflection on how we might be able to take things forward. Yes, as Jackie pointed out, there was a rescue mission and we ended up with decisions as weak as they are. And some will say, well, it shows that multilateralism still works. I would question whether or not that is actually a testament to multilateralism working. But it points to the fact that the process that we're engaging in now for decision making at the multilateral level is significantly flawed.
We've mentioned a lot the new collective quantified goal in this discussion, but for many people, they may not be aware of what that is, or we might be aware that's a commitment now of $300 billion US per year by 2035 that builds on the earlier commitment of $100 billion per year by 2020 that I'm not sure that we even reached. But would anyone like to provide any more nuanced reflections on that goal and perhaps what it doesn't include, or the other financing sources that are controversial?
I can start off, and Janine is obviously the absolute expert on the specifics of the NCQG, but it sits in a broader context. So it's essentially just a climate finance target, as you're describing, Catherine, that sets how much developed countries are supposed to be on the hook, but also the overall finance that's going to be mobilised, a lot of which will come from private sources as well as public sources under the way that the goal was formulated. And why it's kind of so important is because we know that finance is critical for developing countries and the most vulnerable countries to actually implement the climate plans that they've put forward, whether that's their plans on adaptation in their national adaptation plans or their plans around reducing emissions in nationally determined contributions. That also includes adaptation. So we know the next round of NDCs, nationally determined contributions, these climate policy plans are due in February next year. So one of the key questions with the finance goal was, well, if there's not enough money being put on the table, what's the possible ambition that can be achieved for those? And then what are the consequences for actually getting anywhere close to only 1.5 degrees of warming? So that was the broader context. And what it tended to mean was that the finance discussions leaked into every other area of the negotiating agenda because they were critical to what ambition countries might have around mitigation. They were critical to how they wanted to respond to the global stocktake. They were critical to how much adaptation finance was on the table. And they're even sort of represented in other areas like the gender work program, where there are questions around financing for those sort of important programs. So what it did mean was that it was excessively easy for the negotiations to break down or get blockages. And there were some countries that were very clearly, Saudi Arabia was identified quite strongly in the press as being actively trying to slow down the negotiations to limit the capacity to deal with particular issues around fossil fuels, and that sort of had this sort of knock-on effect across all of the different negotiation streams. But as Janine identified, the other thing that was really difficult in the specific finance stream, the NCQG, was that until the final Saturday text before this is after the conference is supposed to even end. We hadn't seen a number in the text. And as many countries said, it's impossible to negotiate about all the other stuff. Who's going to contribute? Is it developing countries? Is it private? If we don't even know what the target is. So that made it very, very difficult to understand what deal they were signing up to, and produced a lot of frustration that then sort of followed through in all of the other negotiating streams. So it was really critical. It was a finance COP in the sense that finance was key to unlocking all the other parts, it felt, of the negotiation.
Thanks, Jackie. And Janine, it'd be great to hear any further reflections. And I suppose, you know, what we're looking at now, if we're going to reach the 1.3 trillion aim, which some have said is really what we need to be looking for, Professor Nick Stern being one of them, there is going to be, it's been indicated in the text and in the negotiations that there will be a shift towards other financing. Jackie mentioned private, but also the multilateral development banks. And obviously that comes from governments, the MDB's funding comes from governments, but it's also often, in most cases, distributed through loans rather than grants. And so this is a key area of concern for countries in the global south, being, you know, encumbered by these heavy grants as well. So I wonder if you have any comments on that, Janine. Loans, sorry.
Yeah, on loans, yeah. There's a lot I would love to say, but I know we're running out of time. So, so maybe for those on the call, the 100 billion was the start. That was in 2015 reaffirmed once the Paris Agreement was adopted as the monies or the finance that would be provided by developed countries to developing countries. With progressively worsening climate impacts and our interest in having a 1.5 goal, keeping the global warming below 1.5, we need more money. And developing countries, particularly small island developing states and least developed countries, rely heavily on public sources of financing. So that's the significance of the climate finance goal, especially for vulnerable countries. Those groups of countries had indicated that they wanted minimum allocation floors within the context of the operating entities of the financial mechanism, but also through multilateral development banks and bilateral channels, which would prioritize grant and concessional finance for them. But that would not materialize. What is in the decision, and this is where I will just focus on, is a decision to triple the outflows from operating entities of the financial mechanism that serves the Paris Agreement and the Convention. And operating entities would include the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility. Developing countries argue it also includes the Loss and Damage Fund, and it also refers to the Special Climate Change Fund and the Least Developed Countries Fund. Why is that relevant? Because these climate funds, these multilateral climate funds, have a mandate through the Paris Agreement to actually provide financing to SIDS, to small island developing states and least developed countries, with a focus on grant and concessional financing. So that's why, without being able to get the minimum allocation floor, the alternative was to provide for more significant financing flowing through these operating entities, which have this mandate to provide better quality financing to small island developing states and least developed countries. So I think I would just focus on that as one of the deliverables within the context of the new collective quantified goal. There's more to be said about what that 1.3 trillion means. And in fact, if once you read through the decision, you'll realize it's not a goal. It's just an enabling clause. So it's a number that's headlined, but the context within which it's referenced is only as an enabling clause. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's great, Janine. Thank you. We could talk about the finance aspects for a much longer period of time. I was hoping that we might get a chance to also hear some questions from the audience. So please, if you do have a question, pop it in the Q&A chat and we'll get to them next. We'll just finish up now with, well, after this, what comes next? So, Kate, do you have any reflections on what comes next, both in terms of the parade of COPs in the next few years, but also in terms of your focus around young people and education?
I think it's really important that young people have opportunities to speak, and not just be given the way that the talks now occur. Being able to not just be present at COP, but to able to participate in a really meaningful way is important. Because otherwise, if there isn't a kind of global understanding of what climate change education is, how else does it happen, apart from the people that are there that then can actually then go and action something after? So even if it is, you know, an amazing eco-activist that's 10 years old there with their mum, that action amplifies once they go back to school. And so they're the kinds of things as an educator that I think are really important. And that if we're going to talk about climate justice or, you know, intergenerational equity, which is what every youth dialogue was about when I was at COP, then those things only occur through climate change education. And we need to have young people in the center of that rather than adults also deciding what that education looks like, because they do have a good sense of the world. Sadly, in Australia, I think the ban on social media has even made me more upset about climate change education this week, because you know, many of our young people get amazing climate change communication and education through social media that they now don't have access to. So the implications for us in education, I think, are even greater to make sure that we get that right. And so if COP continues to change, at least ensuring that we do, civil society gets to play a role, academics get to play a role, so that we can actually make a difference rather than a kind of closed door space that makes decisions without us that then, you know, the implications are on. We just have to have a seat at the table.
Yeah, very strong points there, Kate. Couldn't agree more. Jackie, what comes next in terms of your perspective?
Well, I think everyone's already looking down the road to the future COPs and hoping that there's a bit of a change with the forthcoming COP 30, which will be held in Belém in Brazil. It is likely to have a much stronger focus around civil society, around nature, and around Indigenous perspectives and knowledges, which I think will be really welcome change after the last COP. But there's also very significant challenges in the city where it's being hosted, which is not a very large city. So the idea of accommodating 60,000 people is probably going to be unrealistic. And then, of course, we're hopeful that we'd have some announcement about COP31, which Australia is bidding for together with the Pacific. That didn't happen at COP29, and so because there's a Turkish rival bid that remains in place, the Australian government seems very committed still to COP31, but a decision now probably won't come until June later next year, June next year, at which time we'll be beyond the Australian federal election and whatever implications that might have for climate policy. But more generally, in terms of what comes next, I think many in the sort of legal area are also thinking about possibilities beyond the COPs. This week, we saw the International Court of Justice getting underway with its hearings in a landmark advisory opinion case, where they're looking very generally across all areas of international law to understand what obligations countries have to reduce emissions and safeguard against climate change. And interestingly, that case started all the way back with a group of Pacific law students in Vanuatu deciding that they wanted to do something active about the challenges they were facing and looking to the World Court to help them. Whether that process will unlock anything, we don't know, but it's important to bear in mind that there are these other alternative processes going on alongside the COP that are an important way of challenging the outcomes that we get at COP, and perhaps offering some hope too that there are other ways to achieve action.
Yeah, and a powerful example of young people's voices, Jackie. That's that'll be fascinating to watch, and I'm sure you're keeping very close tabs on that, and you can update us. Janine, what comes next from your perspective?
Thanks, Catherine. I've been busy answering the Q&A questions. Yes, I think there are going to be quite a number of processes between now and Belém for COP29. So just coming out of the new collective quantified goal itself, the presidency, Brazil and the incoming presidency and Azerbaijan are tasked with conducting consultations on how to close the gap of that 1.3 trillion. So there's the Baku to Belém roadmap. So I think we'll see a big process there. And I think overall we will see Brazil taking a major role in trying to coordinate a more ambitious London for outcomes in COP29, COP30. And I think what's relevant coming out of COP29 is that many of these big decisions, like the global stocktake follow-up, which didn't land, other issues such as the issues around loss and damage, the mechanism that deals with loss and damage, that didn't land, issues around how do we maintain this focus on the transitioning away from fossil fuels. All of those have actually been built up now to be discussed in Brazil. And I think that's significant because now Brazil was really basically going to be the COP that looks at NDCs. Now we have a COP that's going to be looking at major processes that will begin in 2026. So I think there's a lot of focus and build up and engagement that will be necessary from now through to COP30. And I think it's really important. You mentioned, Catherine, the role of academia. Kate has mentioned the role of civil society. All of these different actors need to be engaged and actually coming forward. I think it's useful to look at other processes as well. So currently there are preparations for the next Financing for Development conference. And many of the issues that were discussed in Baku are being discussed presently in the context of the Financing for Development. So climate finance, MDBs, international financial institutions, all of these are also being discussed within that. So I think it's really important to keep that wide angle view of all these various processes and being engaged with them. Not just governments only have that limited purview of what they can do. It really requires others to kind of push the envelope to get more progressive outcomes. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a really good reminder, Janine, that the COP sits within a matrix of many other global decision-making frameworks, multilateral processes. The G20 we saw made some comments through the COP that were perhaps not seen as super helpful because the decision really has to occur at that COP level where all of the countries that are signatories to the UNFCCC can participate. The degree to which their voices are heard and allowed and so on, as we've heard in this webinar, is often suppressed. But the broader picture of governance processes globally is really critical to understand. So thanks for that as well, Janine. So we've got a few minutes for any questions. I see that our panelists have been very conscientious and have responded to most of them. So there's actually none in front of me at the moment. I know there was a question, thanks Ben for this very political one, around Saudi Arabia as one of the main blockers reported by the media. Yeah, as Janine says, it is difficult to single out one country. But there were a range of different walkouts, as we did also hear from Janine. The comment from Kate Dooley around the 100 billion goal. Yeah, and how does that actually differ in real terms in terms of around the value of that? It's not a significant increase, Janine's noting here, given inflation. So yeah, really, what do we have to celebrate in terms of that new commitment? And I think Jackie's answered Margaret's question around the International Court of Justice, and with Jackie's overview about what that means and what's happening at the moment. Any other questions in there that for any people that can type quickly, please pop them in. While you're thinking of that in the last couple of minutes, I just wanted to flag, given the uncertainty of COP31 and who's hosting COP31, we know that countries generally get together in their groups of 3 to discuss strategy, to discuss support, aligning potentially different negotiation streams. Given that COP31 hasn't been announced, what does that mean for the trajectory of the next 3 COPs? And is that even an issue? Does anyone want to comment on that?
I'll just start by saying that I think there was a level of surprise that there wasn't a resolution reached on COP31. I don't know how many people I spoke to from other countries who sort of said, oh, but isn't that already locked in? Isn't it the Australian Pacific COP? So there wasn't great awareness that there was still the Turkish bid in the process. And unfortunately, the UN FCCC, the Climate Change Secretariat and the functions there don't have a good way of unlocking the process where there's 2 competing bids and no one's standing down. It's all supposed to emerge by consensus. It may, if there's no result that emerges by June. I think they're very, very keen that we'd know by June whether it's Turkey or Australia. There may be an unusual process where it goes to the plenary for a vote. I think Australia in particular is very not keen on that particular approach, and so is hoping for a resolution prior to that. But obviously it does limit the amount of time and runway of preparation into the different COPs. That said, I think there's already been quite a lot of bilateral discussions held between the Brazilian presidency and the Australian government in anticipation that that might be the sequence. And definitely on the university side, we are participating through our COP Universities Alliance of Australian Pacific Universities in groupings that connect us up with other alliances that existed for the UK COP, that will exist for the Brazilian COP, that existed for previous ones. So even there is that thinking going on about how we can create a continuity of programming and ambition across the different COPs, even if we don't know hosting decisions as far out as we'd like to.
Thanks, Jackie. We've got about half a minute left, and perhaps that's time for a controversial quick response to the comment that Kate's popped in here. And I noted in my opening that there was support for perhaps a presidency that does not that supports fossil fuel phase out and demonstrates a high level of ambition, as Kate writes here. What does that mean for Australia? Any quick responses in the seconds that we've got left? Should we actually be supportive of Australia's bid to host COP31? Kate, do you want to go first?
I feel like that's a hot potato and I should just quickly throw it away. I know what many young climate activists would say. That can be my response.
Okay. Perfect. Janine?
What's good for the goose is good for the gander, right? I'll leave it at that.
Oh, look, I'll have a go because it's
Okay.
sort of my responsibility in a way, isn't it, to take this hot potato? We wouldn't be doing a COP Universities Alliance if we didn't think there was value for hosted in Australia. Absolutely, there are issues with Australia's fossil fuel record. Absolutely, many climate activists are understandably nervous about hosting in Australia and how the Australian government might dominate Pacific interests. But I think also on the other side of the equation, Australia has a very active civil society. It has an empowered research sector. It has voices that can raise and try and influence what the Australian government might do and hold its feet to the fire about the ambitions it expresses to speak for the Pacific. So faced with the alternative, which would be another COP in the part of the world that we've just left, a COP in Turkey, I'd absolutely go for holding a COP in Australia and go hard on the Australian government in terms of what it might bring to the table if it was holding the presidency.
Yeah, great, Jackie. Thank you for handling that hot potato expectedly very, very well. I think we're left with that message to go hard. Absolutely. It's likely that we will host it. So that's the message to everyone who's joined this webinar, is to do all you can to push in many different ways to make sure that we do take the urgent transformative action that's needed to address climate change in all of our different scenarios and in with all the different hats that we wear. So I'd like to thank our panelists, Jackie, Janine and Kate. Wonderful discussion. Thank you so much for that. And thanks all for joining. See you next time.